Well, good evening everybody, and welcome to your community group and to part one of our series in 1 Samuel, The Making of a King. I just want to give you some teaching points tonight to aid your discussion going forwards. The first thing that I want you to know about 1 Samuel is where it fits into the larger context of the biblical story. 1 Samuel follows on from Judges and from Ruth. That's important because of the way that Judges ends. Judges ends with the words that Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. In other words, anarchy ruled at that time. The cycle in the book of Judges was that the nation of Israel would rebel against God and would become unfaithful. God, in response to that and their breaking of the covenant, would send another nation in to pillage, to rule, to wreak havoc on Israel, until such a time as they repented. And when they did that, not so much that they repented as they cried out to God for help. And God would remember his promise, and he would raise up a judge, a leader, to overcome whoever the enemy was. And after that leader had done that, they would rule over the nation of Israel for a period of time, usually until they died. Then after the judge had died, it was only a matter of time until anarchy began to reign again, and the cycle would begin all the way at the beginning. Israel would rebel, and God would send a nation in, and so on and so forth. Until you get to the end of it and we're told Israel had no king and everyone did as he saw fit. Ruth tells the story of Ruth and Boaz, but ultimately it's about their son Obed, who would be the grandfather of Jesse, or the grandfather of David, the father of Jesse. Now, that's important because 1 Samuel, really at its core, is going to become all about David. It's about the making of a king. But suffice to say that as we get to this point, we're coming at the tail end of Judges. Eli is the priest at the tabernacle at this point in time. The tabernacle was what existed before the temple. It was a movable temple, basically. It was a big tent, it was a tent of meeting, and it was the dwelling place of God until the temple was built. So that's the background to 1 Samuel. The second thing that you need to understand and realize is the background to Hannah in this story. Now, for us, one of the hardest things that we have to do in life is to wait. We live in a world of instant everything, right the way down to instant coffee. Waiting is often the hardest thing that we have to do. And waiting becomes even harder when life hasn't gone the way that we wanted to, when we had certain expectations or certain dreams, and those haven't been realized, they haven't been fulfilled. Hannah was barren. She couldn't have children. And year after year she went to the tabernacle. Year after year she went to worship, we're told in the story. And year after year she didn't have any children. Now Elkanah, Hannah, Peninnah, those are all nobodies in the story. They don't feature anywhere else in the Bible in the sense that they're not part of a great royal family. They're not power brokers in the nation of Israel. They're just a family from the hill country, from the backwaters. But what we do know about them is that they were faithful in coming every year to worship. They understood, Elkanah and Hannah did, and Peninnah, that Hannah's womb had been closed by the Lord. Hannah's misery was compounded by her, by Peninnah, who the passage actually refers to as her rival, because she taunted her, she made fun of her, she picked on her. Perhaps even to the point of saying, you know, Hannah, why do you come to worship God? Because what has he ever done to you? He's done absolutely nothing. Now, all of that leads to the point in our story that drives Hannah to pray and to cry out to God. The reality is Hannah could have either turned her back on God, resented God for everything that he did, or she could continue to turn to God and to seek his help. And of course, that's exactly what she does. Now, as we begin to get into the passage, as you ask some of the questions, and as you discuss what the application of it is, one thing that you have to remember is almost the secondary character in the story, who's actually the main character, and that's God himself. You see, as we go through the book of 1 Samuel, we are going to be asking ourselves the question, not how are these people in the story an example to us that we should emulate, but what is this story teaching me about God? What is this teaching me about how I should relate to God? What is it teaching me about how God works in people's lives and how God works in the world? The story of Hannah is in Samuel not because it is the norm, but because it is unusual in and of itself. God is doing something much bigger than just giving Hannah a child. Now for her it had great personal implications, but what we'll discover is that this prayer that Hannah prays will actually change the course of history. That through this prayer that she prayed, through the son that God gives her in Samuel, God would be making a king. He would be raising up a king. And so it changes the events of all of world history. We're also going to be asking, how do I process the world around me now that I know and understand the way it is that God actually works? One of the questions you might want to spend some time discussing tonight is, does God care? Does God really care about me? And how is it that God expresses His care of me? Where do I see that most clearly in the Bible? And is that enough? When God calls me to wait, when my hopes and my dreams are dashed upon the rocks and they don't come to fruition or to realization, who is it that I'm going to turn to? Hannah never adopted a fatalist attitude. She never said to herself, okay, well, this is my lot in life and I just have to deal with this. She turned to God in faith and asked God to deal with her. And the interesting thing is that long before Hannah had a son, Hannah was changed. Hannah's face was no longer downcast. Hannah was able to go back and eat with the family, which is something that she hadn't been able to do. The reality is that sometimes, is that prayer always changes things. Sometimes prayer changes the circumstances, but sometimes, and more importantly, prayer actually changes me. What prayer does is it doesn't say, God, this is my will and I want it to be your will. What prayer does is it teaches me to become like Christ and to submit to the Father's will. So that just as Jesus said, Father, take this cup from me, but not my will, your will be done, we can turn to our Heavenly Father and say, Lord, you know that I'm struggling. You know that this is not how I had wanted life to turn out. But Father, if this is your will, I understand that you are working all things together for my good. And so I'm standing here before you, casting all my anxiety and casting all my care upon you, because I know that you care for me. I hope you have some great time discussing this passage and discussing some of the applications that flow out from it. Looking forward to seeing you on Sunday. Cheers.